Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Most of you probably know the four main language skills: writing, reading, listening, and speaking. But there is a fifth skill that people often forget, but is just as essential for communication: culture. Today, I'm going to explain why learning culture is so important and give you a few tips on how to improve your cultural literacy. You can find the full transcript of this podcast for free on the Thinking in English blog. You can find great content on my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast. Go and leave a follow over there. And leave a like, a rating, a review, or a follow wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's episode. Learning a language is not just about learning vocabulary and grammar. You can spend hours, days, and years memorizing words and studying simple grammar rules. But this doesn't mean that you will be able to communicate effectively in your foreign language. To learn English, it is also important to learn culture. Language and culture are like two sides of the same coin. You need both to be able to effectively communicate. Culture is a part of language, but language is also a part of culture. It's impossible to separate these two things. Of course, without knowledge of vocabulary, grammar, alphabets, and pronunciation, you will not be able to speak a language. There is no argument about this. These are essential. And these form the basis of almost every language class out there. But at the same time, English students need to also be learning about culture. They need to become culturally literate. Or I guess you need to become culturally literate. So, what do I mean by culture? Culture is a complicated, wide ranging, and much studied idea. According to the dictionary, culture is the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. And as this definition suggests, across the world, across populations, across classes, across religions, there are completely different cultures. One way of imagining culture is to think of a big ocean with an iceberg floating in the sea. An iceberg is a floating big piece of ice. If you see a picture of an iceberg, if you search on your phone for a picture of an iceberg, you will notice the top part of the iceberg above the ocean. This is the easy to see part. But the majority of the iceberg cannot be seen. It is deep below the sea. Only a small amount is visible above the ocean. The majority is below the ocean. So when it comes to the culture iceberg, I guess we could say, the easy to see things floating above the ocean are things like language, arts, food, clothes, celebrations, and music. When you look at a culture, these are the things we notice immediately. I currently live in Japan, so I'll think about Japanese culture for a second. Things that are really easy to notice include foods like sushi, udon noodles, okonomiyaki, the Japanese language, popular culture like manga and anime, traditional festivals and traditional religious celebrations. However, just like an iceberg, the majority of culture is not easy to see and is difficult to discern. The hidden parts of culture include roles, rules, values, customs, beliefs, traditions, and status. People who live within the culture Know and understand these things without thinking about them or questioning them. These unspoken parts of culture are created and influenced by history, religion, values, and assumptions. You cannot learn to read, write, or communicate successfully without also learning and understanding the unspoken aspects of culture. I always remember my first day at work in Japan 6 years ago due to a slight cultural mistake I made. I was working at an English summer camp for junior high school students, and I was about to eat my first ever Japanese school lunch. I was one of the last people to collect my food, and I took a seat with a group of junior high school students. I was very hungry, so I started to eat my lunch as I was one of the last people to pick it up, only to realize that all of the students were looking at me strangely. It turns out that in Japanese schools, you are supposed to wait until everyone has been served their lunch, even if it's hundreds of people, and then for someone to say the word itadakimasu before you start eating. So, no matter how much you study the language, you would never know this specific part of culture without also learning culture too. You would never know the traditions about language and food. In 1989, E.D. Hirsch published a quite controversial book called Cultural Literacy, in which he discussed the importance of knowing and understanding the basic cultural knowledge needed to participate fully in society. Although he focused on immigrants and the US education system, which is why the book was controversial, the concept of cultural literacy has now been extended to learning the skills required to thrive in different cultures. According to ABC Life Literacy Canada, cultural literacy means being able to understand the traditions, regular activities, and history of a group of people from a given culture. Understanding the cultural context allows you to learn the right meaning for words, and the more you understand a country's values and background, it is easier to learn the ways of speaking and expressions. To truly learn a language, you must also learn the different aspects of a society's culture. A lot of what we communicate about is culturally specific, and so are the words we use. Think about the conversations that you have in your daily life with your friends in your own native language. How often are you talking about things that are only really relevant to people who live in your country, people who have the same lifestyle or upbringing as you do, right? And this is the same when you learn a new language. If you were to go to the UK, if you were to go to USA or Australia, you would need to learn the kinds of things that people in those countries talk about. So, for example, ordering chips in the UK and the US will get you a different food. If you had an American, an Australian, and a British person in a room together, and you ask them what their favorite football team is, they would give you different answers. But they wouldn't just give you different teams, they would give you three teams from three different sports. In America, football means American football, the NFL. In the UK, football means soccer, football. The most of the world calls football. And in Australia, football, depending on where you are, could mean Australian rules football in the south of Australia or rugby league in New South Wales and Queensland. Wearing thongs in Australia is acceptable in public because they're a type of footwear, but has a very different meaning in the rest of the English speaking world. It's a type of underwear for women. Asking for a rubber in a shop in the UK would get you a pencil eraser, or in America, it would get you a condom. When I first started working in Japan, I had a class on the third floor of a school. So I walked up to the fourth floor because the Japanese and the UK floor numbering system is different. In the UK, the third floor is the third floor above the ground floor. So the fourth floor in Japan and in America. More difficult than just culturally specific vocabulary are the values and customs required to communicate effectively in a foreign language. There is a high chance that your country, your culture, and your language differ from English in this regard. One of the things I struggle most with in Japanese is the complicated system of grammar used in hierarchical situations and with differing degrees of formality. So, in a nutshell, Japanese people use different verbs and different nouns when talking to children, friends, acquaintances, your superiors, or your juniors. All completely different vocabulary systems and grammar systems as well. In languages across the world, there are assumptions and features that reflect gender roles, idioms based on things from the country or region, and ways of speaking that differ considerably. In the UK, to signal that you are intently and carefully listening to your conversation partner, you should make eye contact and listen silently. But in Japan, there is a language feature called aizuchi, which is incredibly common, and it means Japanese people frequently interject in a conversation. Rather than being rude, as you might assume in the UK, frequently interjecting in a conversation is seen as normal. It's giving feedback to the your conversation partner to show that you are listening. Moreover, some languages tend to be blunt and direct. Other languages are indirect and have complex ways of turning you down. I have often had problems in the past which involved not understanding when my boss was rejecting my request for something because the method or way of saying no in formal Japanese is not as clear as in the UK. In some societies, culture and language are even more obviously tied together. I'm specifically thinking about majority Muslim countries or cultures who use Arabic greetings and vocabulary regularly without even speaking Arabic as their main language. In these languages, the way to greet each other and say hello is often a religious phrase or reference. Without knowing the cultural significance of religion in these societies, the vocabulary can be a little meaningless to learners. I have included all of these different examples of language features to highlight how important cultural knowledge is in addition to language knowledge. You can learn every Japanese word, but without understanding the fact that Japanese culture is hierarchical, you probably will not be able to choose the right vocabulary for the right situation. The same is true in English. Learning culture will help you to communicate more successfully. If you learn English grammar and vocabulary without understanding the culture, you will be much less effective at communication. In fact, many of the mistakes made by English learners are not due to problems in grammar and vocabulary, but due to misunderstandings in culture. Certain sayings in your language may make sense, but in English, they will be completely different due to our culture. So, how can you improve your cultural literacy? I've told you how important culture is. So now I want to show you a few different ways to improve your cultural literacy in English. But I guess I should be more accurate. Improve your cultural literacy in British English or American English or Australian English. And even within these different types of English, within British English, there are different cultures, right? So there is no such thing as learning English culture. And as an English learner, you cannot become culturally literate in every single English speaking society. Instead, if you are planning to move to California, or you're planning to move to London, or you're planning to move to Brisbane in Australia, you want to become culturally literate in those situations and those societies. So, how can you do this? Well, you could watch movies or TV shows from the culture in which you are interested. I've made a few episodes on TV and movies before for Thinking in English, but just to reiterate, you will be able to learn how native people speak, notice the expressions, accents, vocabulary, and tones regularly used. You can also start to learn the values and history which influence language. And TV and movies are probably the easiest way to become more culturally literate. A second method is reading. You could read newspapers, magazines, blogs, or literature. By reading different sources and types of material, you will be more connected with vocabulary, you will understand certain writing conventions, and you will work out how native speakers use meaning. And third, traveling, studying abroad, or living in another country is probably the most effective way of becoming more culturally literate. The opportunity to use, practice, and learn languages in the real context is, of course, a great way to learn culture. On this episode of Thinking in English, I have tried to explain and emphasize the importance of learning culture to becoming more fluent in English. Without knowing the cultural context and background to a language, you will not truly be able to understand the meanings, values, assumptions, and roles that are accepted in a language. As a native English speaker, I unconsciously know these kinds of cultural rules. But as an English learner, you need to learn and understand these rules too. Are there any cultural differences between your native language and English? In vocabulary, in grammar, in way of speaking? Let us know. Let me know in the comments on the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Let me know on Instagram or comment on Spotify if you listen on Spotify. I'll put this as the question. If you're on Spotify, definitely leave me a 5-star rating, please. My ambition is to become the highest rated English learning podcast on Spotify. We're well on the way to doing that. 1.1 thousand reviews so far, which is amazing. Let's try and get to 1.5. That's my next goal, I think. Go over to Instagram and leave me a follow. Nearly at 5,000 followers, which is amazing. Like, review, rate, follow wherever you are listening right now. If you listen on Apple, I really appreciate some Apple reviews as well. My Apple listeners don't leave me as many reviews as my Spotify listeners. So maybe we can change that. And if you'd like to donate to me, go over to the Thinking in English blog or click the link in the description of this podcast, and you can donate and help support Thinking in English. And I think that's everything. So I hope you all have a great week. I know it's been hot all around the world, so make sure you're drinking a lot of water and staying safe. It's currently 9 a.m. in Japan right now, but already 35 degrees, and I don't want to leave my house, but I have to. So, well, have a great week. See you next time.